Peter Willcox, your response to the amnesty that you all have been granted.
Well, we're glad it happened, but we're still wondering why we need to be amnestied for something we didn't do. According to the World Court, we were arrested illegally on the high seas, illegally brought into Russia, and illegally detained. So we don't feel, A, that we have anything to apologize for, or B, that we need amnesty for.
And the suggestion by President Putin that you are acting at the behest of some foreign government?
That just seems like such a silly and stupid claim that I really don't need to respond to it. Greenpeace books are open, our fundraising. We don't even accept corporate or government sponsorships of any kind. So such a claim is just ludicrous.
Dmitry Litvinov, can you talk about what it is that you did, that you were first charged for, and then how long were you held for before you were granted bail, and then now, of course, the amnesty decision?
Well, what we did and what we were charged for are two completely different things. We went out to the Russian Arctic in order to shine the light on the destructive activities that are being carried out there by the Russian and foreign oil companies. There is a rush for the Arctic shelf right now that has now become navigable due to climate change, and oil companies are rushing in there in order to start drilling for oil. This is in an area which has extreme meteorological conditions, which has very difficult navigational conditions, and where there's practically no infrastructure for cleanup in case of, or rather I should say, when an oil spill would occur. And, well, I heard earlier today we're speaking about the Gulf of Mexico. We saw what happened in the Gulf of Mexico, where even under the most favorable conditions, we saw very, very difficult environmental results. If such a spill were to occur in the Arctic, it would be absolutely catastrophic. So the purpose of us sending a ship and going there earlier this year was in order to bring attention to the problem and to carry out peaceful, nonviolent protest, as we have been doing all around the Arctic region. We protested over Greenland, over Norway, over Alaska, etc. It's not a Russian problem, it's unfortunately a global problem. The charges that were brought against us to start with were, the first one was that of piracy. We were accused of an armed takeover of a ship for personal gain. Each one of the elements of that sentence had nothing to do with what we did. It was no takeover, there was no ship, and there was certainly no personal gain involved. We have spent altogether 2 months, one of us actually a bit longer, in detention, first in a prison in jail in Murmansk in the north of Russia, and then subsequently 2 weeks in St. Petersburg. We've been released a little bit over 3 weeks ago, and since then we've been kept, well, I should say, in a much bigger and more comfortable cell. We're still detained in Russia, but we're at least allowed to be staying in a hotel and to talk to each other.
Dmitry, I wanted to ask you, at the time you were jailed, your father wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post urging your release. And the piece was titled, "My Son Facing Russian Prison for a Peaceful Protest." In it, he wrote that Dima has the sad distinction of possibly becoming the third generation of political prisoners in our family. Can you tell us something about the history of your family and these run-ins with authorities because of its political involvement?
Sure. I think actually Dad got it a bit wrong. I think actually it's the fourth generation, if we're going to really count. My great-grandfather was one of the leading communists before the revolution, and so he opposed the Tsar's regime and ended up being our prosecutor for that. He subsequently became one of the closest collaborators of Stalin and Lenin, was actually foreign minister under Stalin. My grandfather was accused for a political crime and spent years and years in prison during Stalin's time. His fate was described in a number of books by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And then my father went on a protest demonstration against the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet tanks in 1968, together with 6 other people. The 7 people got fairly hard sentences. My father spent 5 years in Siberia. The whole family went there. I went to school there. My sister was born there. In fact, the first time that I was ever arrested for a Greenpeace action in Russia, my grandfather gave an interview where he was asked, "What do you think about your grandson getting arrested by the KGB at that point?" And he said, "Well, it's the third generation going to prison for a good thing."
Peter Willcox, can you share your history? You go way back to the first Greenpeace ship, the Rainbow Warrior. Talk about what happened there.
Well, like Dima, I'm sort of a third-generation activist. My grandparents and mother were all before the House Un-American Activities Committee. My grandfather lost his company because of his leading a peace delegation to China in 1952. And I started with Greenpeace. I started working on boats for the environment in 1973. I joined Greenpeace in '81, and yes, was on the first Rainbow Warrior when it was blown up by the French in Auckland, New Zealand in 1985.
Just tell us briefly, for people who don't know that history, talk about what French intelligence did.
Well, the French intelligence service was ordered by Mitterrand to stop Greenpeace from going to French Polynesia and protesting the nuclear testing issues there. We had just come from the U.S. Marshall Islands, where, thanks to the U.S. testing program, we had to move a group of about 350 islanders from their purposely contaminated island to a slightly safer one. We went to New Zealand to prepare to go to French Polynesia, and the French decided to anticipate us. The first bomb blew a 6 by 7 foot hole in the side of the hull. The second bomb that went off about 45 seconds later trapped our photographer, Fernando Pereira, in his cabin and killed him. He was the only crew member with 2 children, and his murder certainly ripped a hole in their lives that really has never been repaired.
And then talk about what happened to you. While you've been granted amnesty, you were jailed. Starting with Peter, can you both describe your time in jail and where you go from here?
Well, when you're held in Russia under investigation for a crime, it's called isolation, and you're in one cell 23 hours a day. You supposedly have about an hour in an exercise cell, which is only slightly bigger than the cell you were first kept in. And you're really isolated from all your family, colleagues. It was a month before I was able to speak to my wife. It was almost a month before I was able to speak to my lawyer. Yeah, you're in isolation.
Yeah, I can add to that. I mean, I think that absolutely isolation is the worst, one of the worst elements of being held in that prison. I mean, the physical conditions were not the main part of the problem. Well, sure, it was crap food and, very cold at night, and, you only got 15 minutes of shower per week. But that you can live with. We can live in fairly tough field conditions. The worst thing is the psychological pressure. I think what Peter is talking about, this isolation, was one of these very strong elements of pressure that made life very hard. Another one is this uncertainty. You don't know what's coming. You don't know how long you're going to be sitting there. You don't know how it'll result. I mean, on one hand, the rational part of your mind says, well, this is impossible. Even in Putin's Russia, they cannot lock 30 people for something they didn't do for 10 to 15 years, which is what the first sentence was that we were looking at. 19 of them foreigners. It's just not acceptable. It's not going to happen. But then you're in jail. Then you're in jail.
We told ourselves that the first day, and that night we were in jail.
Exactly. And then you go to an investigation, and you see these very serious men in very serious uniforms and telling you absolutely seriously, we are convinced that you're pirates.
The most bizarre evidence. They claim that we weren't really environmentalists. They claim that we led an armed attack on the rig. I mean, the first rule about a Greenpeace demonstration is that it's nonviolent. The second rule is that there's absolutely no property damage to the object of the action or demonstration. And you do these things, and these are the kinds of things that prevent a reasonable prosecutor from even thinking of the word piracy. So on one hand, it seems so absurd. On the other hand, you're sitting in detention, you're sitting in jail.
And there you are.
And you're facing 10 to 15 years.
And you don't know when it's going to end. So that's the second. And the last thing, I think, kind of very much along those lines, is just this feeling of this is so unfair. This is so unjust, you know. We didn't do anything wrong that is anywhere near the kind of response that we're getting.
We didn't do anything we hadn't done the year before.
Exactly. So, I mean, we met a lot of people in prison, our cellmates, and some of them, most of them, were in there for a crime, or at least reasonably suspected for a crime. And these are nice enough fellows, and you know, some of them were, you know, probably should have been treated more easily than they were, or whatever. But there was a crime committed, so there was a reason why they were locked up. For the 30 of us, it was this feeling that they have no reason. It's so unfair. So I think those three pieces of psychological pressure, for me at least, was the hardest thing to deal with, the isolation, the uncertainty, and the unfairness.
And Dmitry, I wanted to ask you about this decision of the Russian government. As many as 20,000 people amnesty. Do you see this as any kind of a major shift in the increasing authoritarianism of the Putin government, or is this more a public relations ploy in the run-up to the Winter Games, the Winter Olympics?
I don't claim to be any sort of political analyst, Juan, so I'm not even going to try to answer that question. I'm just very happy that that we get to go home soon, even though there is this sour aftertaste, as Peter said, that you know, we shouldn't have been arrested to start with, and we should not be given an amnesty. We should be given an apology and a medal, in my opinion.
And we're still most concerned about the fate of our 4 Russian colleagues that have to continue to live here. And now they may have criminal records hanging over their heads. So that's something that worries us a lot.
Absolutely. And as far as your question is concerned, well, as far as I understand, quite a number of those prisoners that are to be released are indeed will be qualified and is qualified as political prisoners. But then there are also just people who have been arrested for a violent crime or some other type of crime. And this is an amnesty that is associated, I understand, with the 20th anniversary of Russian Constitution, some sort of a magnanimous act. And look, after those 2 months in prison, if people are being released, you know, I'm glad for them, you know, no matter what crime they have committed. For them personally, I'm glad that they don't have to be sitting in those conditions that we were sitting in.